You know, I don't think any parent ever begins their parenting journey by saying, you know what, I want to do something that hamstrings my kids. You know, I want to do something now early on and in the formative years of their life that is really going to negatively affect them for the totality of their lives. I just don't think that's how we start. We're going to be talking about something interesting today. We're going to be talking about education. You know, as parents, we all want the best for our children, or I'm going to assume we all want the best for our children. And sometimes we can just take education for granted. But those things that happen in the early formative years of our children's life, just as with us, can have long-lasting positive or detrimental effects. The Bible tells us, train up a child in the beginning on how they should live and how they should walk, and they will not depart from it when they get old. So this is what we're going to be talking about today on Practical Discipleship. Thank you so much for being here. This is Pastor Clay and this is Pastor Dan. Let's talk about Christian education versus public education. We're really looking at the idea of philosophy of education in this segment. So what you got, guys? What do you think?
Well, I think it really comes down to a different question. You know, are we shaping the next generation, or are we letting culture do it? You know,
exactly.
And you use the word hamstring. I love your opening, by the way. That's a great way to start off, because nobody really does set out to do the wrong thing right away. Nobody sets out to create a failure for somebody else. At least I hope we don't.
Yeah.
But, you know, how are we setting our kids up? You know, the Bible is clear, going all the way back to Genesis, that we are the ones who are responsible for our kids, their upbringing, and we're to teach them to love the Lord their God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. And that's our goal. We were never released from that responsibility as parents, you know. And so when it comes down to the question or the debate, you know, public school or Christian school, it comes back to my question. Well, who's raising our kids? Are we doing it, or are we letting culture? Because no matter which school we put them in, public or Christian anymore, we are letting a culture raise our kids. And, you know, as we talk, and it was just before we came on, Tony and I were talking. I don't know if you were there, Clay, but I said, you know, with the idea of opportunity scholarships that we enjoy here in America, you know, the idea of learning in a Christian bubble is completely gone, or the argument of never getting beyond that bubble is completely gone, because so many kids, the culture is there too. So it comes down to that. And so, you know, I'd throw in a third. Go ahead, though.
Yeah, that's one of the points I was going to bring out as we're talking is we have to understand that in this day and age, a Christian school, for example, the one I taught at before I came on staff here, the majority of the students in that school that attended that school did not have a church home that they regularly attended.
Right.
So the idea of it being a Christian school so that the students there were now somehow insulated or isolated from the stuff that goes on in the public schools, from the standpoint of disciplinary issues, those things in both of the Christian schools I taught in, those elements are still there. So you're not isolating your kids from, or insulating them from, some of the stuff that happens in public schools. It is still going to be there. The difference is going to be in what they're taught, the perspective that it's taught from.
Right.
You see big differences in science.
Right.
Nowadays, unfortunately, you see big differences in the way history is taught.
Right.
But those other things are still there, and it goes back. We as parents, we can't just give over the responsibility for the education or the discipling of our children to someone else and not be involved.
So I would say that to any parent considering education for their children, cultural engineering is going on. Rather, you know, when we use the terminology, and I feel strongly about this, when we use the terminology secular, the idea behind the terminology is that you have the religious and then you have the secular. And I would submit that when we say public school as opposed to religious school or homeschool or whatever that looks like, that we're not talking about something that is secular. We may be talking about something that is I'll use a little different word, maybe profane. What I mean is it's disconnected from a moral basis on the outside, but on the inside, there is still ideology. There is still a religion. It's just you're saying it's a secular humanist religion as opposed to a Christian religion.
There is. I mean, think about this. We live in a time when just this last Friday, the Supreme Court had to make a ruling on whether parents could opt their children out of LGBTQ, whatever.
Right.
And what would be considered pornographic material. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there was a time when it didn't matter where you stood on the LGBTQ issue, we could all agree on the fact that you don't sexualize our children.
Right.
You don't bring sex into math or history or these other subjects, and it's not something that's taught to our children. We could all agree on that, and now it's there to the point that some are saying, well, parents shouldn't be able to take their kids out of it, and this had to go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Right.
We've come from a time when there was a time in the United States where there was no difference. There were no Christian schools or public schools. They were all Christian schools.
They were all schools with Christian values.
Christian values. The
Right.
Bible was a textbook in the schools,
especially in the colleges. Yeah.
And now we've come all this way, and thinking we have made all these advancements, and we've tried to separate the two.
Yeah, and we look at what has happened in the context of our public schools, and the biggest issues, a few decades ago were, chewing gum and talking back and doing those things, and it's gotten culturally we're seeing the ramifications of the decisions that we are making as we move away from God. Dan, you've got some.
Well, what Clay said just brings me back kind of to the point I was trying to make. The fact that we have to have somebody rule on whether parents have an option or whether parents have the responsibility or the right to choose how their children are educated and what kind of things they are exposed to, we were never released from that responsibility.
Right.
Period. And so parental choice, man, it is sad. You're right that it has to go all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States of America to determine that parents have the right to determine what their children are exposed to. Mm-hmm. But it's a hard choice. I want to, for those who maybe a Christian school seems like it is not feasible economically,
right?
We still know that God can work in any environment,
Amen.
in any setting, and it comes back to how you're training your kids at home. If you have to send your children to public school, if for whatever reason that's your only choice, your only viable choice, man, teach them well at home. It's okay,
right?
But it really does need to be your option to train them well in the home and to disciple them well while they're under your immediate care. But the problem is we stack too much up against the word knowledge. We use knowledge as this thing that props all the other things up. And, we're cautioned about knowledge in the Word, and, not to get, churchy about it, but knowledge and wisdom are very different.
Oh, very different.
And when we teach our children to be wise, whatever they're gaining academically, they can either accept or they can question, and they can question it wisely. But how are we setting them up at home? That's what it really comes down to.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is, regardless of the options of education that you have or feel like you have, you still have the responsibility. As a parent, and I think that's fundamentally huge. Kim and I, when we were deciding, how we would educate our children, and I think we've all heard the mantra. Our generation really heard that knowledge is power, and that you need to educate, educate. And something that I have found out is, and I've experienced this even with my own children, that knowing better doesn't always equate to doing better. And if it did, churches would look a lot different.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that we do need to have basic education. Now, when we talk about indoctrination, again, we're talking about some of the philosophical aspects of education. Do you want your children inundated with the philosophies and the doctrinal ideology of what the culture is? If you're going to say yes, you need to be very, very careful for one huge reason. That is fluid. It is constantly changing based upon one person's perception of how that knowledge should be utilized or leveraged or what that final outcome. So we always looked at what I call goal-oriented education. And, you know, a lot of people look and say, well, the reason I want my kids to go here and to do this and to take these classes is so that they can go to college. Well, you know, and that may be good. You may be saying, hey, I want my kids to have the best shot at college. Well, I'm going to encourage you, as we looked at, look beyond college. Look to career. In other words, what education, what understanding, what philosophy, what perspective, what knowledge, what application do you want your children to have once they have completed the false paradigm of academia? Anybody in college is not real. It is not where you stop. It's where you finish that baking process, which started, like you said, hopefully at home. And then people get out into the real world and realize, oh gosh, you know, so think of the kind of people you want your children to be, or that they need to be, not, you know, just what do we need to do to get to this. Look at the long-term goal. And I believe that it causes us to embrace and say what's important. Think about the most important things in our lives. Would you rather your children be, and I'm not saying that it's an either or, I'm not saying that these are even, you know, opposites, but would you rather them be highly, brilliantly educated in mathematics or a particular field, or would you rather them be kind and loving, compassionate individuals? I'm not saying that it can't be both, but I'm saying if you can have either without having the other. Or you can, like you said, regardless of the context, you can have somebody who is educated intentionally with brilliant subject matter, and then you can still have somebody who has a guiding set of morals that will help them not only be in society, but bring value to society in a greater capacity.
It comes back to this, the whole idea of a worldview.
Yes.
Most people don't understand, they don't realize you have a worldview, an underlying philosophy by which you view everything in the world.
Yes.
And, well, I don't want my kids indoctrinated in it. Well, then I don't know how they're going to function in the world, because it doesn't matter. Everybody is approaching something. So Christian schools, hopefully, are teaching things from a biblical worldview.
Right.
The public schools, due to the efforts to keep the secular and the sacred separate, as they would say it, to keep religion out of the schools, they teach from a very different worldview perspective.
An atheistic or humanistic worldview.
And
there is no apology for that.
Well,
That's just true.
And I'm also not condemning public school teachers. I'm not saying every teacher in the public schools has an agenda and they're out there to push this agenda, but it is written in the materials.
Correct.
It is written. It is in the fact that you can't teach the idea of creationism or even intelligent design alongside the theory of evolution.
Yes.
You know, in these things, it's again, our worldview comes across, it comes out, it comes through, whether we're consciously trying to promote that worldview or not. It just becomes a part of who we are.
So it really affects how we live. And,
it does.
So my wife and I, as we consider the education of our children, and we're very proactive in that education, we considered this. When your worldview matters.
Absolutely.
It affects how you do everything. So our thought was, one, morality matters to us. One particular worldview from a Christian world perspective is the idea that morality matters, number one, and that there's a basis for that morality. When you take away the basis for that morality, which in our minds is God, what basis for morality is left? And the idea is, well, you should be kind. Okay, why? if you take away the idea philosophically from a child, and this is what we've seen in the educational generation that we're experiencing now, if you take away the idea that there is a creator and there is accountability and there is a true standard, non-changing moral compass or morality as established by the creator, then all of a sudden something happens. Then why? Then morality becomes something that is optional or objective, or subjective rather. It's something that's optional and that it's subjective. So why should I be kind? Is that just an additional tagline? If I choose to be kind, then how do I define kindness?
Exactly. That's the thing is
Yeah.
you know, the Christian worldview, the biblical worldview, it doesn't just tell us to love our neighbor in some type of nebulous terms that, okay, well, now that's left up to Dan to decide what loving his neighbor
Right,
means, and you
right.
to decide what it means for you and me the same. It then lays out and gives a functional definition of what love is, and so therefore now that becomes the standard.
The anchor.
If you and like you said, I don't know if you take God and the scriptures out of the picture, I don't know what you anchor your morality to.
And we're seeing in our culture that
And so it becomes subjective. Then it doesn't matter because, you know, I know it goes to extremes, and this may seem like an extreme point, but if there's no objective standard to right and wrong, then you can't condemn what Hitler and the Nazis did to the Jews.
or
You can't.
what's happening in abortion clinics or anything else.
Or anything else for that matter. You can't condemn me for whatever it is you feel like I'm doing is wrong, because there's no objective standard to hold. We have laws. Laws are an objective standard.
Right. So can laws, and I know this is philosophically deeper, but can laws even exist against criminal behavior when there's no objective moral standard? So anyway, it's good. I mean, this is a great discussion. Dan, you looked like you were having an epiphany over here for a moment.
Okay. You know, I was reading an article just this morning, and the title of the article, one of the longest titles I've ever read, by the way, was "I don't want a robot to read me a book." You know, and it wasn't chewing away at AI, but at the same time, it was trying to point out a couple things. And what is said to me in light of this discussion is that education by its nature is programmatic. You know, it comes down to who did the programming, you know, and whether or not we're going to change it as the wind begins to blow a different direction. And that's what we see in the public education system as public opinion changes and we lose that objective moralism. You know, we lose any sort of anchor, or we deny that there is an anchor to be had. We begin to shift the program a little bit, and we begin to speak in a way that doesn't. It's not natural. You know, we're responding to the programming more than we are to the need to be educated. And I think about, you know, the number of Christian schools that I've worked closely with, you know, in the things that they say as they promote themselves, you know, like, and they always want to use the phrase academic excellence in there somewhere. And that's okay. It's good to want to teach well, to teach people to see and learn and understand. You know, but it's what they do with that when they leave part. You know, and you mentioned a few moments ago that we've kind of made the college degree and then the next one and the next one the pinnacle of all education, and really it's not. Like you said, it's more the starting point. And I saw some random information this week that said the number of PhDs so vastly outnumber the academic positions available for those people. It's ridiculous. So. If you're educating yourself well, but your gifting is really in mechanics, you know, be a well-educated mechanic. But if you are carrying the gospel, if you're educated with the truth of the word that is going to be an anchor all the way through, you could still take that into your job as a mechanic as well. You don't need necessarily the PhD. I'm not anti-college. I'm not anti-degree or education. What I am is pro parents being involved with their kids, because there's no substitute for that. That is our role as the church, and that's our role as parents as well.
Yeah, that's a philosophical foundational difference, is even in what you just said. The idea that our culture says, well, the next step is, the idea with a Christian worldview is that God gives each of us giftings and abilities. That's void. The world says, hey, you can be anything that you want to be if you get the right education. They don't understand that unless you're doing what you're gifted and designed to do, there's not going to be fulfillment. Money is not the catalyst for fulfillment within the context of the human life. It's just not. It, like education, is simply a tool. So if you have a tool, but you don't have, any of the fulfillment that comes along with the utilization of that tool or any of those. So when it comes to this, thank you for that. That was very clear, very good. And Clay, you said it this way. I just want to reiterate. You said it's not that the educators are evil or wicked within the context of public schools who may be peddling some of these ideologies that are, humanistic or atheistic. It's written into the curriculum. And we want to acknowledge that. Education is a tool. But the moral moorings, the foundations that make life, let me say it this way. And I want to speak to parents specifically who may be watching and considering the education of their children. I'd love to hear you guys kind of chime in on this as we kind of close out this segment. But what kind of world do you perceive that we live in right now? What do you think about the world? And the next question is, what do you want the world that you live in tomorrow and that your children live in tomorrow to be? Because how we educate our children and how we prioritize the values that really matter in our lives and in our culture is really what's at stake. Understanding mathematical equations is great and it is necessary, and reading, yes, it is fundamental to being able to learn. But what you learn and how you learn become very subjective to how you are and how you live. You can use great education to promote and further very nefarious things, or you can use it to walk and enhance the community and the lives of ourselves and those around us. What kind of world do you want tomorrow? Because your children will be shaping that world based upon the influence that is in their lives. And Dan, I love the way you started this. You said, we as parents, we cannot abdicate that to anybody,
right?
Because we're stewards. And that's a fundamental truth concerning the Word of God.
And the reality of it is, I hate to put it in these terms, the other side, but they understand exactly what you were just saying very well. That's why there's been a push to bring other things into the education and place them into not just a specific class, but across the entirety of the education. So we have to teach this. We have to include this in history.
It is social engineering.
So that we have to include this in math.
Yes.
We have to bring this ideology, this agenda, however you want to term it, has to be expressed in every subject.
Yeah.
Because we understand that more importantly than teaching them to be good at algebra, we need to teach them that this worldview, this way of thinking is correct, is right, is beneficial. The big thing, and this will be my closing.
Okay.
My closing thoughts is if first of all, if you live in North Carolina, if you're not familiar with what's called the Opportunity Scholarship here, just Google it, the North Carolina Opportunity Scholarship that provides funds for families to send their children to private schools. Yes, there are income requirements. They're very generous income requirements.
Right.
Check that out. If you don't live in North Carolina, see what your state has to offer. I know that more and more states are offering this. People are waking up and realizing that, parents should have a choice, and that having a choice will lead to better schools for everybody.
Yeah, good.
But it doesn't matter if you're a parent, if you're sending your child to a public school or a private Christian school, nothing is going to be more important than your involvement in their education know what's going on, know what's being taught, know the teachers, be as involved as you possibly can be in their education. Don't just send them to the kitchen table to do their homework. Sit at the kitchen table and help them with their homework. This is how you find out. This is how you can speak to some of the stuff that is being taught in the moment when they're dealing with it, not later as an afterthought.
Educational after action. I remember we utilized I did homeschool, and we utilized a particular Christian curriculum. And we would do educational after actions. I'm a pastor, so my kids wanted to know theologically, does this align? What does this look like? And out of that discussion came some very, very rich things. Dan, I don't want to derail your closing thought or final thoughts. I want you to have time to go through all of those, but I want to ask you a question. What we're talking about from your personal experience, how important is this?
Well, I think it's absolutely foundationally important. My children were in public school growing up. I have grandchildren who are in public and Christian schools. I see the difference up close. I know that for each of my children, as they got into their final years of high school, they wanted by choice to be educated at home. They wanted to be homeschooled.
Wow.
They realized the environment they were in was not the one that they were going to finish well in.
Wow.
And so we were homeschool parents. We were working homeschool parents with kids in the other office at that point in each of their lives, several years apart. So that's a good stretch. But it's so important that we arm our kids well, because academic success is not the only goal.
Right.
It's to raise godly kids who,
Right.
like you said, who love well, and that we remind, like you said, that the classroom is only the beginning.
Right. So I'll thank you. I'll kind of close with this. If you believe that there is a dichotomy, if you believe that there is that Christianity and education, or Christianity and intelligence are in some way in positions of opposition, I would say you're absolutely mistaken. The most brilliant minds in America, in the world, are often minds that acknowledge the idea of a creator. All through history, the founding fathers, these guys read their stuff. You'll see the brilliance of these guys. You'll also see in their writings the acknowledgement of the holy, the acknowledgement of God himself, incredibly powerful. When you depart from that, the Bible tells us, and this is something that I've seen in the real world, if you really want to raise brilliant, intelligent children, begin with children who recognize intelligence as embodied in the person of God, the Creator, who understands all things that are concerning creation. It unlocks a level of openness to true intelligence that it can't be found within the context of atheism or humanism. There's a groping in the darkness without that light. The Bible tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning, or the acknowledgement or the respect of God is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. And that is true. And you can see this played out in not only the understanding, but the application of so many lives out there right now. When we talk about the foolishness that comes to light, what we're seeing in our culture very often is a result of the education that people have received, or the lack of education, or the indoctrination that people have received. When I heard recently that math was being taught to be something that's racist, I'm going, we are way, and I understand that there is some balance coming back to our educational system now, but just think how much indoctrination and social engineering is taking place to try to convince people of something like that. Anyway, we need to be awake. We need to be wise, and we need to take that responsibility. And I want to encourage you, please take it seriously. Take that responsibility. It will enable you to have a relationship and to help be a part of changing tomorrow for the better and changing today. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us. Dan, Clay, thank you so much for being here. Until the next Practical Discipleship, God bless you and have a wonderful day.